Anxiety, OCD and depression don't just go away, but they may lift if your living environment gets easier or if you avoid change, but that's not recovery. Proper recovery arises as you live life differently, as you become a new person who thinks and acts in new ways. So let me delve further inside my head and explore ways of looking at things differently. Now bear in mind, I started this 20 years ago, okay, when there was no YouTube videos and there wasn't many good self-help books around. And of course, these days, people are pretty clued up about the mind and the body connection and about intelligent ways of looking at themselves and life. But I'm going to still keep going back to basics, because all it takes is one little aha moment, and then you might have a considerable shift in your awareness of who you are, what you want, and what's going on inside yourself. Now, one of my earliest realizations was about my mind and the thoughts inside my head. All my life, I had experienced a busy internal dialogue. It was really noisy. It was judgmental. It was fearful. It would catastrophize about everything. It was constantly analyzing everything, commenting on everything, telling me what to do, telling me what to be afraid of, and reminding me all day long of my limitations, all the things that could go wrong, how useless I was, and it was guessing what everybody else was thinking about me. And back then, if someone had said, "What's that voice in your head? What's that inner dialogue?" I'd have said, "It's me," okay? And it honestly never crossed my mind that they were just the musings of my brain, you know, and that I could ignore them, okay? And because I thought that they were me, I would argue with them. I would try to understand them. I would keep asking why, and I would battle with them to try and stop them, which of course made everything worse. And the technique that really changed things for me, and I detailed it in video 13, was I learned as the observer to associate each of my thoughts to an imaginary character in my brain. But of course, these characters were of the brain and not me. There was like a narrator who would just talk all day long telling me what was going on out there, and then there was the judge, okay, and then there was the victim and the pleaser and the self-conscious one and a dominant one, and so on and on. And each time a thought came up, I would observe it. I would listen to its message, and then I would associate it back to which character I would imagine that it had come from, okay? And it didn't take long before I had mapped out a whole list of characters who all seemed to have differing strategies for me. And very quickly I saw that each time my rebel said something like, "Oh, that would be fun," then the judge would come in and say, "Don't be silly." And then the victim would come up and say, "Well, you look stupid if you do that." And then the worrying guy would come along and say, "Well, what would go wrong if I did any of those things?" Okay. And it just took me about 2 weeks to realize there's this whole soap opera going on in my head, in my mind, or in the brain's mind, that up until then I'd been addicted to watching, and worse, I was a part of. You know, I thought it was me, but it wasn't. It was the brain's mind, and I was the observer, the rider of the horse, as I keep bringing it back to. And through silently observing them, it became clear that they were just little kids. Their stories were my stories at that age. My brain had adopted those perspectives back then, and it hadn't updated them. A few years back, I watched a Disney film called Inside Out that animates all the voices inside a young girl's head. And it made me laugh out loud because it was a more friendly, dumbed-down version of how my brain used to be. And if you haven't watched it, I would certainly advise you to go and take a look. It's very clever, and it's very, very accurate. So, off the back of this one simple technique, I had consciously detached myself from the unconscious, okay, and all of those out-of-date musings of my mind. And because I could see how childish and contradictory all those thoughts were, I could see that they weren't the truth of what I should do. They were just fearful little children trying to stop me from doing things. They thought safety was to avoid or control things, okay? And I had thought that they were me. I realized that I didn't have to give them any attention. And so my new intention was to retrain myself to ignore them, to place my conscious awareness somewhere else, as I've been saying over and over again. And it consciously dawned on me that the words safety and security had been entirely misunderstood by my brain, and it was unconsciously and automatically running strategies that imprisoned me. Like a long-term prisoner, preferring the familiarity and the perceived security of a prison rather than having the responsibility of being free and having to face life in new ways. My OCD had become my familiar prison, the comfort of my routines, the predictability, the cleanliness of my home, the staying in rather than going out, talking myself out of doing things rather than talking myself into doing them. It felt safe, but it wasn't a good kind of safe. Now, this realization really shocked me, and it became clear that my perceived need for safety, or you might say my brain's conditioned need for security, was at the heart of my problem. Somehow, the question dawned upon me that if I had a magic wand and I could go back into my childhood and I could reprogram my brain, what would I reprogram it into? And I think this is an interesting question to ask yourself. So I started by examining what I thought safety was. And the answers that came up were quite interesting. When I said to my brain, what is safety? It would say things like, to not feel anxious, to not look silly, to not look like you're going mad, to not be judged in bad ways, to not show vulnerability, to not fail, to not break all the rules, to fit in, to not let people down. And it kept coming up with statements like that. Once again, this really shocked me, as what it seemed I feared were my own emotions, what others would think of me, and how I would use all those thoughts and feelings to beat myself up and reject myself. They were the fears of a child. But of course they were. Of course they were, because they were the programs that I'd set up in my brain all those years ago when I was a child, and they were still running the show unconsciously, although I was living consciously as an adult. I hope this is making sense. I figured that rather than attempt to redefine what safety was, I ought to explore what was the opposite of safety, what was the opposite of security. I needed to flip that old story and see what attitudes I would need to develop to become more comfortable with them. Phrases like danger, risk, being out of control, embarrassment, being the center of attention, taking responsibility, trying new things, failing, putting myself first, saying what I thought, standing up for myself, exploration, adventure, and things like that. And as I was sort of thinking of all these things of what was the opposite, of course it kicked off all the old fear programs inside of me, okay? But there was another little voice too in the background. Maybe my rebel, maybe my adult, I don't know. But with hindsight, okay, I could see that it was my warrior and my nomad. And they were both saying, yes, please, we would like some of that. We're sick of all this stuff. And it had been the conditioning of my settler unconsciously driving my actions and my fears for so long that it had become the loudest and the most fearful voice within me. My warrior wanted action and to achieve something, wanted me to plan, okay, to speak my mind, to move forwards, to move towards my goals, to stop caring if I was liked, and for me to ignore any negative emotions that got in the way of taking action. And my nomad wanted more fun, excitement, to be spontaneous, out of control, to try new things, travel, adventure, break some rules, make connections, and to be able to experience the whole range of emotions, from anger to danger to love. Okay, they're just emotions, and they're fun and they're exciting. All of those behaviors could only be realized if I had a new set of attitudes, maybe even different attitudes for each of my characters. So that's what I did. I started looking at these things.